Imagine this, a group of colonies under the iron fist of one of the world's most powerful empires. A ragtag group of rebels, farmers, and merchants who had had enough. Tensions rise, shots ring out, and a war erupts that would change the world forever. But how did a scattered band of colonies defeat the mighty British Empire? What really happened during the American Revolutionary War? Join us as we explore the truth behind one of history's greatest rebellions. From fiery protests and midnight raids, to secret alliances and legendary battles. This is the story of how 13 colonies fought for their freedom against impossible odds. Chapter 1. Before the Revolution. Before the first musket was fired or the first cannon roared, the roots of revolution were already taking hold in the hearts of the American colonists. But the truth is, the seeds of discontent were planted long before any declaration of independence. In 1763, the British had just emerged victorious in the 7 Years' War, gaining control over vast territories in North America. But this victory came at a cost, a heavy financial burden that the British government expected its colonies to help shoulder. For the colonists, however, the idea of paying taxes to a distant monarch without representation in Parliament felt like an injustice. They had no voice, yet were expected to bear the burden. It began with the Stamp Act of 1765, a tax on every piece of printed paper, newspapers, legal documents, even playing cards. What the British government saw as a simple tax was viewed by the colonists as an assault on their rights. No taxation without representation, they cried, but the discontent did not stop there. The Townshend Acts in 1767 further inflamed tensions, as Britain sought to impose new taxes on goods like glass, tea, and paper. Colonial merchants began to boycott British goods. Smuggling became rampant, and a simmering anger took root in the hearts of many colonists. Then came the Boston Massacre in 1770, where British troops opened fire on unarmed colonists, killing 5. This event further fueled the flames of rebellion, uniting the colonies in their anger toward British rule. And then, in 1773, came the infamous Boston Tea Party, a bold act of defiance where colonists, disguised as Native Americans, dumped over 300 crates of British tea into Boston Harbor. Britain's response was swift and severe. The Intolerable Acts were passed, meant to punish Massachusetts and reassert British control. But instead of quelling the unrest, these acts united the colonies even further. What began as a protest against taxation was now becoming something much larger, a full-scale demand for independence. Chapter 2. The Start of War. April 19, 1775. The early morning air is still and quiet in Lexington, Massachusetts. But on the horizon, something stirs. A column of British redcoats, marching with precision, moving toward the small towns of Lexington and Concord. Their mission? To seize a cache of Patriot arms and ammunition. But what they didn't expect was resistance. On Lexington Green, 77 colonial militiamen, most of them farmers and tradesmen, stood their ground. No one knows who fired the first shot, but it would become known as the shot heard round the world. In mere minutes, the Revolutionary War had begun. The British quickly pushed through Lexington and moved toward Concord, where a larger force of American patriots awaited. As the British searched for weapons, colonial fighters launched a surprise attack, ambushing the British soldiers as they retreated to Boston. What started as a simple mission to disarm rebels had turned into a full-blown battle. The British suffered nearly 300 casualties by the end of the day, a stunning loss for what was supposed to be a quick and easy operation. As the news of Lexington and Concord spread, the colonies mobilized, and the first sparks of revolution ignited into a wildfire. Chapter 3. Washington's Leadership. With the war officially underway, the Continental Congress knew they needed a leader, a commander who could unite the colonies and lead their armies to victory. In June 1775, they found their man in George Washington, a tall, dignified Virginian who had served with distinction in the French and Indian War. Washington faced a daunting challenge. The Continental Army was far from a professional force. These were everyday men, farmers, blacksmiths, shopkeepers who had little experience in battle. Many lacked proper weapons, and the army itself was poorly supplied. To make matters worse, they were going up against the most powerful military on earth. But Washington was a master of strategy. He knew that direct confrontation with the British Army would only lead to disaster. Instead, he adopted a strategy of attrition, aiming to wear down the British over time while keeping his army intact. His goal wasn't necessarily to win every battle, but to outlast the British and make the war so costly for them that they would eventually give up. Yet, despite Washington's leadership, the early years of the war were filled with setbacks. The British quickly captured New York in 1776, and it seemed like the revolution might be crushed before it truly began. Washington's army retreated time and time again, outgunned and outmatched. But in one of the most daring moments of the war, Washington led his troops across the icy Delaware River on Christmas night 1776. The surprise attack on the Hessian forces in Trenton was a resounding success, restoring hope to the Patriot cause. Chapter 4: Allies and Enemies. The American Revolution wasn't just a local affair. It was part of a much larger global conflict. And after the American victory at the Battle of Saratoga in 1777, the world began to take notice. The victory at Saratoga convinced France that the Americans had a real shot at winning the war. And so, in 1778, France officially entered the conflict on the side of the colonists, providing much-needed money, supplies, troops, and most importantly, naval support. France's involvement was a game-changer. With French ships guarding American shores, the British Navy could no longer move freely, and French troops fought alongside the Continental Army, turning the tide of the war. But France wasn't alone. Spain and the Dutch Republic also joined a fray, turning the war into a global conflict that stretched from the Caribbean to Europe and beyond. For Britain, this was a nightmare scenario. The war was no longer confined to a small group of rebellious colonies. Now, the British were fighting on multiple fronts, draining their resources and stretching their military to the breaking point. Chapter 5: Turning Points. By 1777, the war had dragged on for over 2 years, and the Continental Army was in dire straits. Supplies were running low, morale was even lower, and the harsh winter at Valley Forge in 1777 to 1778 tested the resolve of every soldier. At Valley Forge, Washington's army faced freezing temperatures, disease, and starvation. Nearly 2,000 men died that winter. But it was also at Valley Forge that the army found a glimmer of hope. A Prussian military officer, Baron von Steuben, arrived and began training the soldiers in European military tactics. Under von Steuben's guidance, the Continental Army transformed from a ragtag group of militiamen into a disciplined fighting force. With their new training, the Continental Army was ready to face the British head-on. In 1778, the French officially joined the war, and the conflict began to shift. British forces, under General Cornwallis, turned their attention to the southern colonies, where they hoped to rally loyalist support. But after a series of brutal battles, including the Siege of Charleston and the Battle of Cowpens, Cornwallis found himself cornered in the small town of Yorktown, Virginia. In 1781, Washington saw his opportunity. With the help of French forces, Washington's army marched toward Yorktown, while the French Navy blocked Cornwallis's escape by sea. After weeks of siege, Cornwallis had no choice but to surrender on October 19, 1781. The war, for all intents and purposes, was over. Chapter 6: The Treaty of Paris. The victory at Yorktown was the final blow to British hopes of retaining the American colonies. The British government, exhausted by years of war and facing pressure from other global conflicts, finally opened negotiations for peace. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed, officially recognizing the independence of the United States of America. For the colonists, it was a moment of triumph. But with independence came new challenges. The fledgling nation was heavily in debt, its economy in shambles, and it now had the daunting task of building a government from scratch. But the significance of the American Revolution didn't end with the creation of a new nation. It set off a chain reaction that would change the world. Revolutions in France, Haiti, and Latin America would soon follow, inspired by the success of the American colonies. Chapter 7: The Price of Freedom. Freedom, however, came at a price. Over 25,000 American patriots lost their lives during the war, and countless others were wounded or displaced. The war also divided families and communities, as loyalists who had supported the British were forced to flee, many of them resettling in Canada or Britain. For Native Americans, the war brought even greater hardships. Many tribes had sided with the British, hoping to protect their lands from American settlers. But with the British defeat, Native American lands were increasingly encroached upon by the new American government. African Americans, too, faced a complex and often tragic reality. Some fought for the British, lured by promises of freedom, while others fought for the Patriots, hoping that independence would extend to them as well. Yet, despite the rhetoric of liberty, slavery persisted in the new nation for decades to come. The American Revolutionary War was more than just a fight for independence. It was a struggle for ideas, for self-government, liberty, and the belief that all people have the right to determine their own futures. The revolution was a catalyst for change not only in America, but around the world. So, what does the American Revolution mean to you? How did a small group of rebellious colonies transform into one of the most powerful nations on Earth? Join the conversation in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories from history that continue to shape our world today.